So I've grown up in Burke and I had a pretty good time. Made lots of friends, had lots of fun at the river, surrounded by family, and so I was very loved. And I think growing up here has really shaped who I am today. So for me, when I see a young person in Burke, I just see potential. And so I want to see that for all young people in Burke. Help them identify their dreams and their hopes and help them on their way, because that's what every child should have.
Marinuka means caring for others and offering help, and certainly the concept isn't new. We've been doing this for thousands of years, but putting it, I guess, into a contemporary empowerment framework to build a vibrant community again, which we made a commitment that no one would be left behind.
In late 2012, Alastair Ferguson, the chair of the Working Party, contacted Just Reinvest to help children and young people in Burke. And Justice Reinvestment is about finding ways to shift resources out of the prison system and the criminal justice system into communities to support early intervention and crime prevention and diversion.
For a small community like Burke, the key has been how you develop a safe space to have a conversation. And Marinuka is providing that platform to do that.
So we came to Burke and about 60 community members took part in what we call data conversations. And there was universal agreement at the end of that day that they did want to prioritise what was happening with kids and young people to create safer communities.
Part of that we have working groups, one on early childhood, one on 8 to 18-year-olds and one on the role of men. And we have strategies so that we can try and meet the targets that have been set by the Burke Tribal Council.
The model is a collective impact model. So what that means is corporate organisations and philanthropic organisations and other organisations who have relevant skills coming to assist government and community in making real solutions.
It's good that the grassroots people of Burke are nailed down on the actual issues. I think it's good to have all the organisations at the table so they're all on the same page.
Well, I certainly feel a change, and I see that firsthand, and it's how we're working more collaboratively together. I think that's been the key, and we're bringing the Aboriginal community along. That's really driving goodwill as part of this whole process.
I know certainly with incarceration rates of our juveniles in town, there's been a significant decrease over the last 2 years. Crime rates for things such as alcohol and drug-related violence, they're reducing. So yeah, it's a good early sign.
Burke isn't dangerous because we've been constantly working towards creating a safe community. And I don't think it's overly ambitious to think we could become one of the safest communities in Australia, if not in the world.
It's really important to understand that you have to be ready to invest over a longer term, and that what you learn in communities is just so applicable to business process.
What other communities can learn from what's happening in Burke is that data informs meaningful conversations, and meaningful conversations lead to better decision making.
Sometimes Burke gets exposed for all the wrong reasons, and there's hardly a time where they get to showcase all the good stuff that's happening in Burke. And those working groups, it's all about coming up with a new way of delivering services and doing work with organisations to set a good example, I suppose.
Burke does have a lot of heart, and I think that it links directly to the people that are here, and we need to listen to their voice. So that's the main message from me. Go out and listen to your young people, because they'll tell you what they want, and they'll tell you what they need. Yeah. So I've grown up in Burke and I had a pretty good time. Made lots of friends, had lots of fun at the river, surrounded by family, and so I was very loved. And I think growing up here has really shaped who I am today. So for me, when I see a young person in Burke, I just see potential. And so I want to see that for all young people in Burke. Help them identify their dreams and their hopes and help them on their way, because that's what every child should have.
Marinuka means caring for others and offering help, and certainly the concept isn't new. We've been doing this for thousands of years, but putting it, I guess, into a contemporary empowerment framework to build a vibrant community again, which we made a commitment that no one would be left behind.
In late 2012, Alistair Ferguson, the chair of the Working Party, contacted Just Reinvest to help children and young people in Bourke. And Justice Reinvestment is about finding ways to shift resources out of the prison system and the criminal justice system into communities to support early intervention and crime prevention and diversion.
For a small community like Bourke, the key has been how you develop a safe space to have a conversation. And Marinuka is providing that platform to do that.
So we came to Bourke and about 60 community members took part in what we call data conversations. And there was universal agreement at the end of that day that they did want to prioritise what was happening with kids and young people to create safer communities.
Part of that we have working groups, one on early childhood, one on 8 to 18-year-olds and one on the role of men. And we have strategies so that we can try and meet the targets that have been set by the Bourke Tribal Council.
The model is a collective impact model. So what that means is corporate organisations and philanthropic organisations and other organisations who have relevant skills coming to assist government and community in making real solutions.
It's good that the grassroots people of Bourke are nailed down on the actual issues. I think it's good to have all the organisations at the table so they're all on the same page.
Well, I certainly feel a change, and I see that firsthand, and it's how we're working more collaboratively together. I think that's been the key, and we're bringing the Aboriginal community along. That's really driving goodwill as part of this whole process.
I know certainly with incarceration rates of our juveniles in town, there's been a significant decrease over the last 2 years. Crime rates for things such as alcohol and drug-related violence, they're reducing. So yeah, it's a good early sign.
Bourke isn't dangerous because we've been constantly working towards creating a safe community. And I don't think it's overly ambitious to think we could become one of the safest communities in Australia, if not in the world.
It's really important to understand that you have to be ready to invest over a longer term, and that what you learn in communities is just so applicable to business process.
What other communities can learn from what's happening in Bourke is that data informs meaningful conversations, and meaningful conversations lead to better decision making.
Sometimes Bourke gets exposed for all the wrong reasons, and there's hardly a time where they get to showcase all the good stuff that's happening in Bourke. And those working groups, it's all about coming up with a new way of delivering services and doing work with organisations to set a good example, I suppose.
Bourke does have a lot of heart, and I think that it links directly to the people that are here, and we need to listen to their voice. So that's the main message from me. Go out and listen to your young people, because they'll tell you what they want and they'll tell you what they need. Yeah. So I've grown up in Bourke and I had a pretty good time. Made lots of friends, had lots of fun at the river, surrounded by family, and so I was very loved. And I think growing up here has really shaped who I am today. So for me, when I see a young person in Bourke, I just see potential. And so I want to see that for all young people in Bourke. Help them identify their dreams and their hopes and help them on their way, because that's what every child should have.
Marinuka means caring for others and offering help, and certainly the concept isn't new. We've been doing this for thousands of years, but putting it, I guess, into a contemporary empowerment framework to build a vibrant community again, which we made a commitment that no one would be left behind.
In late 2012, Alistair Ferguson, the chair of the Working Party, contacted Just Reinvest to help children and young people in Bourke. And Justice Reinvestment is about finding ways to shift resources out of the prison system and the criminal justice system into communities to support early intervention and crime prevention and diversion.
For a small community like Bourke, the key has been how you develop a safe space to have a conversation. And Marinuka is providing that platform to do that.
So we came to Bourke and about 60 community members took part in what we call data conversations. And there was universal agreement at the end of that day that they did want to prioritise what was happening with kids and young people to create safer communities.
Part of that we have working groups, one on early childhood, one on 8 to 18-year-olds and one on the role of men. and we have strategies so that we can try and meet the targets that have been set by the Burke Tribal Council.
The model is a collective impact model. So what that means is corporate organisations and philanthropic organisations and other organisations who have relevant skills coming to assist government and community in making real solutions.
It's good that the grassroots people of Burke are nailed down on the actual issues. I think it's good to have all the organisations at the table so they're all on the same page.
Well, I certainly feel a change, and I see that firsthand, and it's how we're working more collaboratively together. I think that's been the key, and we're bringing the Aboriginal community along. That's really driving goodwill as part of this whole process.
I know certainly with incarceration rates of our juveniles in town, there's been a significant decrease over the last 2 years. Crime rates for things such as alcohol and drug-related violence, they're reducing. So yeah, it's a good early sign.
Burke isn't dangerous because we've been constantly working towards creating a safe community. And I don't think it's overly ambitious to think we could become one of the safest communities in Australia, if not in the world.
It's really important to understand that you have to be ready to invest over a longer term, and that what you learn in communities is just so applicable to business process.
What other communities can learn from what's happening in Burke is that data informs meaningful conversations, and meaningful conversations lead to better decision making.
Sometimes Burke gets exposed for all the wrong reasons, and there's hardly a time where they get to showcase all the good stuff that's happening in Burke. And those working groups, it's all about coming up with a new way of delivering services and doing work with organisations to set a good example, I suppose.
Burke does have a lot of heart, and I think that it links directly to the people that are here, and we need to listen to their voice. So that's the main message from me. Go out and listen to your young people, because they'll tell you what they want, and they'll tell you what they need. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here, and thank you to everybody joining us on the live stream today as well. My name is Amity Durham, and I'm your MC today, and I'm thrilled to be able to be here and to introduce all our speakers, and I think it's going to be a really inspiring and exciting discussion. I'm a strategic advisor in the public sector business of Amazon Web Services, and we provide cloud technology to governments, non-profits, businesses across Australia. And AWS is proud to partner with Seer Data and Analytics, who are doing amazing work with governments, non-profits and communities, delivering community data and enabling data to be available to communities across Australia, supporting shared local decision making and better outcomes. And a little bit about me. Before I worked at AWS, I worked in the New South Wales and Victorian governments in social policy, in strategy and analytics and evaluation. And I have a passion for how data can help us make better decisions about public investment and public services. And so to have the opportunity to work with Seer Data has been amazing and inspiring in my work. But I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to all First Nations people who are joining us today. And I'd like to introduce Uncle Alan Madden to provide the welcome to country. Uncle Alan is a Gadigal elder from the Aurora Nation, and he's been on the board of the Sydney Foreshore Authority, SBS, the Central Coast Aboriginal Heritage, along with various other organisations. And at the moment, he's a board member of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. And Uncle Alan is also a life member of RAB Sport, has diverse interests, and a business owner of Aboriginal Land Consultancy. So welcome, Uncle Alan. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Elder. For my first song, born and bred in Redfern, the capital of Sydney. Aboriginal, black, Redfern, follow Manly. No, not true. Rabbitohs. Married man. 10 children, 26 grandchildren and 17 great-great. Yes, we did have TV. Just couldn't afford the bloody electricity. We've all welcomed the country. It's always an honour and a pleasure. Just to give you a little bit of an insight of where you are and who we are. As we've all welcomed, first I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations and traditional owners of the lands that you may come from or work upon, and pay my respects to all our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present. Also pay my respects to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or island nation you may have come from. Welcome to Gadigal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters here today, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state or across town, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. And as I've mentioned many times before, was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Only three things surer than that: coming, taxation and going. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here today to welcome one and all to Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own, the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Pean to the west, and Georges River to the south. And in between those three mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on today is Gadigal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. There's an old Aboriginal saying out there, I think it's very appropriate for you mob here today. They say, where there's a will, there's relatives. And as you travel across these traditional lands and waters, may the spirits of our ancestors guide, look over you, and keep you safe. So once again, on behalf of the Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uncle Alan, for that wonderful welcome. So today we have an exciting group of speakers, and I'm sure will all leave us inspired about the amazing work that's already being done in communities, but also what's possible as data becomes more available. So first we're going to hear from John King, who's Chief Data Officer at SEER Data, to set the scene and provide an overview of some of this great work that's being done. And then Christy Mansfield, who is the CEO and founder of SEER Data and Analytics, will host a fireside chat with Alastair Ferguson, the chair of the Marinuka Community Hub. And Alastair will share his experiences and learnings for pioneering shared decision making and operationalising self-determination in Bourke. Margot Beach from the Dusseldorf Foundation will then join the panel with Christy and also share her experiences and insights on the role of philanthropy in enabling shared decision making across communities. And we'll also hear from Alan Operman, New South Wales' Chief Data Scientist, and his perspectives on how we can really scale data sharing across New South Wales and the country, and what's needed from government and data custodians to make this a reality at scale. And then we'll make some time for questions and answers from the room and also the live stream. And our plan is to finish up at around 6:30. And for those that are with us here today in the room, we have refreshments, so please stay on for networking afterwards. So let's get started. So first I'd like to welcome John King, who I mentioned is SEER's Chief Data Officer. So John recently joined SEER Data after a 15-year career in the public sector. He's worked in the Commonwealth, the South Australian and the Victorian Public Services. John grew up in Canberra, graduating from ANU with university medals in arts and law, which is very impressive, John, and then got into data in how he describes as two ways. One being gradually getting into data, and then secondly, suddenly, diving in deep. So when he was at PM&C in the Commonwealth and then Treasury, it was a master's at the London School of Economics that gave him the first taste of data's power, and then began using data gradually in social policy, leading state reforms in school funding, in skills and employment, but then began the suddenly phase. John led the data and analytics team in the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services from about 2018 to just recently. And over 5 years, he has pioneered the use of linked data in Victoria, using advanced analytics to help design services to make better funding and investment decisions and to evaluate social policy much more effectively. And John joined SEER because he believes community data sharing can have an impact, a really positive impact on complex social problems. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Two ways, gradually and suddenly. Doesn't that sum up all things data? And I think it applies to administrative data as well. So if we go back a little bit, was shared suddenly with not-for-profits, sort of late 20th century, with their increased role in delivery, with the public for transparency, with the open data movement, sort of early 2000s. We think it's time for community data sharing to go that same path. It is, of course, far more recent. It's the last few years. It's also, we think, far more radical. Data shared not for information, for delivery, for research, but for decision making. Scores of communities around the country are using data, restricted data now for decisions. You'll hear from Alastair about Bourke a bit later. As they've done so, the sort of barriers are coming down, the benefits are emerging. So tonight I wanted to reflect pretty briefly on the why, the now and the next of community data sharing, and give you my take on data's value, sort of ecosystem that's gradually emerged, and then the role that trust, that technology and that capacity building need to play in that suddenly phase. So I'll talk kind of conceptually and concretely. We'll talk a bit meta, a little bit micro. I mean, my key message is that community data sharing is ready for that suddenly phase, or sort of more evocatively, 1,000 flowers blooming. So let me just talk briefly about sort of my journey to data. Complex problems need local solutions, data-driven solutions, a common view, call it maybe even orthodox. It took me a while, though, to be honest. When I joined the public sector, data felt conspicuously absent. Conspicuous because it felt like the other policy areas had the data and they knew how to use it. Economic policy, infrastructure policy would win the budget battles for minds, if not hearts. But absent because data was hidden or it was hard. It felt like if I listened hard enough, I could help and understand the people that I was trying to help. So classic job for new naive policy officers in Canberra, sort of correspondence to the Prime Minister. I could read people's stories. I could listen to the clients of the little not-for-profit, the board that I was on, or the callers to Lifeline. I was volunteer there for years. I could hear stories. The qualitative was much easier than the qualitative. The equitable, much easier than the economic. But as I think back now, it wasn't just hidden or hard. It also, to be honest, at times felt unnecessary. This was what I think back of as the age of assumption, if you like, where I thought, like many, that we just needed markets and governance and broad-based policies. They were the answers to complex problems. If we could just get choice and competition, if we could just get efficiency and effectiveness, we'd be fine. I was right in theory. The practice said otherwise, how we've learned. And data has moved, I think, from the niche to the centre. It's enabling a whole movement towards evidence-based policy, social impact, social investment, and place-based approaches. And we think, too, it's moving from tightly held to increasingly shared. And what's been particularly fabulous, for me at least since those early days back at Prime Minister and Cabinet, is that we can now illuminate at scale the people that I think everyone in this room is trying to help, and the difference that we are making as we go. And so I was just going to reflect briefly on the value of data, give you my take on the value. So talk possibilities before we talk practicalities. Data helps us see people, places, systems, services. It's like current to our light bulbs. It can light up some of the gloom of decision making. Now, of course, it varies by data source, by quality, whether the data is aggregated, whether it's down at unit level, or whether it's linked. But I want to suggest there are three qualities that data gives us. We can see depth, we can see breadth, and at least most exciting, where I've done a lot of work, we can start to see reach. Those three things are valuable individually, particularly valuable together, even more so when it's combined with community voices, community conversations, community intelligence. That's the value proposition of data. First, I think data gives us depth, gives us that zoom focus. So, I don't know, think of all of the data on a child protection system, for instance. We can start to see beneath immediate occupations, preoccupations, into drivers, into trends, what's in the background, that focused binocular view. And so we can start to glimpse, I think, those elusive whys and help communities with that. Well, how? How do we act? How do we help? The second one is that quality of breadth. Gives us that wide angle view on things. Gives us this capacity to see systemic, not partial. So alongside child protection, we might have a look at early childhood or maternal child health or into youth justice or family violence or welfare. So we can start to see the system. We can see relativities, can see comparisons, start to glimpse that hard whole, that puzzle of whole, and help communities a bit of the where. Where do we help? Where do we help? In child protection, it turns out that a lot of progress would be made in homelessness, in housing. Not surprising, we start to see these interconnections between people and services in place. The third one is this concept of reach. This is a time focus. We can use data to look back in time and predict forward in time. And as we're seeing with AI, in a disruptively generative way as well. So with this, we can start to glimpse the past and the future. If I stay with my child protection, we can follow a family, their parents, the next generation, and ask what would happen. And we can then ask, well, what did happen? And what difference are we starting to make in these lives? It gives us this evaluative perspective. The public sector is starting to use techniques like econometrics, like simulation modelling, like explainable AI to start to predict, evaluate, even at times prescribe options. So we can glimpse the past and the future, and it helps with that why, that whether question. So these three sites, as I've said, together are beneficial. They help communities see what's happening in their communities and come up with their own actions. They do, of course, come with challenges, right? Challenges galore to privacy, to interpretation, to security. But what we are seeing is this emergence of an ecosystem for sharing, where these barriers are coming down, where we are starting to see these benefits. Just want to talk briefly about this ecosystem that is emerging. And so on one hand, we have data custodians, on the other communities, and SEER, like others, sits in this middle, this intermediary, helping bring the two together. And we think there's a huge benefit in sharing data that's currently restricted, somewhere between data that's fully open and data that needs to stay highly controlled, is this Goldilocks zone that we think could be incredibly helpful to communities. And so if I just share an example that Alistair will talk to later with Marinuka, having a data sharing agreement with New South Wales Health, with the local area, that is aggregated patient data that's shared quarterly. It's shared indefinitely with, I think, annual review to make sure that the data is continued to be relevant. Outputs aren't sort of laboriously and individually approved by custodians. Custodians sit around the governance table. It's a collaborative exercise. That's the frontier, I would suggest, of data sharing with community, where we have to move to, and Alistair will share the impact that he's making with his community with that data. I'll give you now a quick example from community side, and if you want to play the video now, what you're going to see is just a quick 40-second grab from Tasmania. This is an outcomes framework introduced last year. Think of the first 1,000 days of kids' life, which we know matter so much for the rest of it. And what you're starting to see here is restricted data shared with community to help decisions. Communities can go in and see the data by this framework for their community. So you can see here, zooming in on Burnie, and have a look at what's going on to help decisions. And what you'll see in a moment is zooming in on just one of the indicators, which is kids and playgrounds, which we know makes a difference, and the kids that are within 500 metres. And so this is Burnie. The red there that we're going to see pretty quickly is kids that aren't within 500 metres of a playground. And so what Burnie can do with that data is use it to uncover and start to make changes that'll make a difference to these kids' lives. Might just stop it playing now. We're going back through. So this is the ecosystem that's emerging. SEER's in more than 50 communities around the country where this is happening, where we are proving with communities' help, the concept of data sharing. But of course, there are challenges with data sharing to privacy, to security, to interpretation. These challenges are significant, don't get me wrong. We think they are solvable. And what I wanted to do is just reflect on three big ones. Scaling of trust, technology, the role of technology and the role of capacity building. Let's start with trust. Data sharing is a really simple model. Request, respond. Community requests, custodians responds. That simplicity is deceptive though. The request bit can be really hard. It'd be hard to know who to ask, what to ask for, how to ask. It was hard enough for me in the public sector, in data, sometimes within my own department, let alone for someone outside in community. And so I want to give huge kudos to initiatives like the National Data Commissioner, whose office is cataloguing, open sharing through a marketplace, templating data sharing agreements, trying to overcome that asymmetry, if you like, of information. So we just know what's available and how to request it. So valuable. So that's the request part. The response bit, I think, having had some experience with it, can be even harder. It's hard for custodians. I get it. I've been one and made requests of many. We are quite rightly asked to take responsibility and steward data. With the sharing request comes risks to privacy, the ones that I mentioned. And often the challenge is that there's a lot of uncertainty. We might not see future risks, future uses even. The future can be distant or dynamic. And where there is that uncertainty, risk can trump benefits. Sort of risky what ifs can trump the beneficial what could be's. And that's why at times requests are turned down, or we err on the side of high control. In another jurisdiction, aggregate data was shared with the community. They weren't allowed to share any insights from the data. They get the data, they just couldn't use it. Here's where we need to make progress, scaling trust. Some of you might know we have some of this, what we're calling trust architecture. We have something called the 5 Safes framework, sort of looks at safety from 5 different angles. It's serviceable, I suppose, but the problem is there's still a lot of unguided grey space, this uncertainty. And in that uncertainty is where doubt exists. So what I think we need is like greater, so what am I talking about? Frameworks, templates, principles, things that are objective, easily shared, widely adopted. Fortunately, there are standards for data sharing coming out soon, international data sharing standards, and we hope they will be widely and wildly adopted. You'll hear more from these from Ian Oppmann on the panel, who is leading this work globally. With these standards, we think that custodians and community can leap more confidently into some of the uncertainty of data sharing. Community can more easily demonstrate their trustworthiness. Custodians can more easily assess it. We can calibrate some of these risks that we're all worried about, put in controls and allow data to flow. Technology. Data sharing and use is essentially a technology-led task. It can put data at people's fingertips and on their screens, like you see here. I don't think so. I don't think the huge progress now is in safety. Cloud-based, secure platforms are relatively mature and getting better and safer all the time. Nor do I think it's in the sharing technology. Thanks to data engineers, we have innovations so that now data can be shared programmatically in real time if we wanted. Gone could be the days of USB sticks floating around or emailed spreadsheets. No, I think the progress is that third one is in simplicity. How do we make data sharing and particularly its use simple? How do we make it community user friendly so that communities can use data, combine it with their own, with provider data, combine it with stories, make meaning of it, present it themselves? That's where SEER is investing, co-designing these platforms with communities so that they can use it. I think too many platforms are too complicated, aimed more at powering business insights than empowering community stories, if you like, aimed at advanced skill sets, not all skill sets. And I think community data sharing comes with an opportunity, perhaps even an obligation, to enable community to use the data themselves. Finally, the last one, and again, this is another one that will come up in the panel, is we need to build capability in communities. And here you see a lovely shot. You'll soon, if you don't already, recognise the person right in the centre. This is a shot from Burke and community and capacity building with Alistair. What I mean here is community capacity, bandwidth, if you like, capability, fluency to access, use and make meaning of data. Now, with the help of philanthropy, with researchers, with unis, with think tanks, I think there's been huge progress. We've seen Indigenous capability built by the Indigenous Data Network. We see work on community readiness. There are micro-credentials available now for community collectors in Tasmania. I think, and I'm interested in Margaret's view on this later on the table, I think there's huge benefits in starting to scale some of these initiatives, trying to move from the individual or the few to the many. But fundamental to this is building the capacity and capability in communities to be able to share data. So SEER's vision is 1,000 flowers blooming in communities around Australia, or to be precise, to use the data, 2,473 SA2s that the ABS counts around this country. So these flowers are community-determined, data-driven actions. There's no uniformity, there's no one right way. They're more wildflowers than flower show. It's pioneering work that communities are doing. It's pioneering work that is needed, empowering communities to lead into the complexity of these issues in the ways that they know best. And so we think data sharing with community is ready for this suddenly phase. We think 3 of the big steps need to be in scaling trust, in simplifying technology and building capacity. And so our call is for custodians to share, building on the progress to date and the standards to come so that they feel willing, able and allowed to do so, for philanthropy to fund, particularly capacity in communities, and for policymakers to keep that focus on place, that hands-open view to policy. Those 3 things, I think, are fundamental to our call. So we think together we can take community data sharing from gradually to suddenly. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for setting the scene, where we've been, where we're at, and the vision for the future. So now we're going to watch a short video just to tell the story of Burke and Marinuka to, I guess, set the scene for the next session of our panel.
So I've grown up in Burke and I had a pretty good time. Made lots of friends, had lots of fun at the river, surrounded by family, and so I was very loved. And I think growing up here has really shaped who I am today. So for me, when I see a young person in Burke, I just see potential. And so I want to see that for all young people in Burke. Help them identify their dreams and their hopes and help them on their way. because that's what every child should have.
Marinuka means caring for others and offering help, and certainly the concept isn't new. We've been doing this for thousands of years, but putting it, I guess, into a contemporary empowerment framework to build a vibrant community again, which we made a commitment that no one would be left behind.
In late 2012, Alastair Ferguson, the chair of the Working Party, contacted Just Reinvest to help children and young people in Bourke. And Justice Reinvestment is about finding ways to shift resources out of the prison system and the criminal justice system into communities to support early intervention and crime prevention and diversion.
For a small community like Bourke, the key has been how you develop a safe space to have a conversation. And Marinuka is providing that platform to do that.
So we came to Bourke and about 60 community members took part in what we call data conversations. And there was universal agreement at the end of that day that they did want to prioritise what was happening with kids and young people to create safer communities.
Part of that we have working groups, one on early childhood, one on 8 to 18-year-olds and one on the role of men. And we have strategies so that we can try and meet the targets that have been set by the Bourke Tribal Council.
The model is a collective impact model. So what that means is corporate organisations and philanthropic organisations and other organisations who have relevant skills coming to assist government and community in making real solutions.
It's good that the grassroots people of Bourke are nailed down on the actual issues. I think it's good to have all the organisations at the table so they're all on the same page.
Well, I certainly feel a change, and I see that firsthand, and it's how we're working more collaboratively together. I think that's been the key, and we're bringing the Aboriginal community along. That's really driving goodwill as part of this whole process.
I know certainly with incarceration rates of our juveniles in town, there's been a significant decrease over the last 2 years. Crime rates for things such as alcohol and drug-related violence, they're reducing. So yeah, it's a good early sign.
Bourke isn't dangerous because we've been constantly working towards creating a safe community. And I don't think it's overly ambitious to think we could become one of the safest communities in Australia, if not in the world.
It's really important to understand that you have to be ready to invest over a longer term, and that what you learn in communities is just so applicable to business process.
What other communities can learn from what's happening in Bourke is that data informs meaningful conversations, and meaningful conversations lead to better decision making.
Sometimes Bourke gets exposed for all the wrong reasons, and there's hardly a time where they get to showcase all the good stuff that's happening in Bourke. And those working groups, it's all about coming up with a new way of delivering services and doing work with organisations to set a good example, I suppose.
Bourke does have a lot of heart, and I think that it links directly to the people that are here, and we need to listen to their voice. So that's the main message from me. Go out and listen to your young people, because they'll tell you what they want, and they'll tell you what they need. Yeah.
Okay, so what a wonderful story, and we are so lucky to have here today Alastair Ferguson, the Executive Director of Marinuka, and on the Executive Committee of Just Reinvest New South Wales. So Alastair is the chair of the Bourke Aboriginal Community Working Party. He's been in that role for more than 10 years, so it's really seen this from the beginning to where we're at today. And in recognition of these amazing achievements, Alastair has been nominated for the Australian Local Hero Award. And in 2015, in recognition of 20 years of work for his community in Bourke, he received the Aboriginal Justice Award at the Law and Justice Foundation. So welcome, Alastair, to the stage. And with Alastair, I'd also like to welcome Christy. Come up. So Christy Mansfield, as you know, is the CEO and founder of SEER Data and Analytics. And she's recognised as one of the leading voices for community data access and sharing across Australia. And Christy was awarded the Trans-Tasman High Growth and Innovation Award in 2022 by the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand. So an amazing achievement. And before founding Data, Christy was Oracle's go-to-market strategy leader for the company's software as a service business. And before this has worked also in Nuance Communication. So a deep tech background, but also a deep philanthropic passion and interest. So Christy's also led a small grant-making foundation in Sydney that pioneered place-based philanthropy. And she was recognised for this work in the AFR's 100 Women of Influence back in 2015. So I'll hand over now to Christy and Alistair. Thank you.
Thanks, Amity. Alistair, here we are on a couch talking about the last 10, 12 years, and watching that video, I felt very emotional myself. And I really want to thank you for your leadership, particularly this moment in time that we're seeing in Australia. And I really want to honour you for that. I think it's outstanding and incredible that the work that you do and in Burke, and the incredible moment we see just last week, the white paper talked about the future reforms, putting data in the hands of community, and your work here in New South Wales with many of your partners has led the way. So thank you, Alistair.
Christy. Well, I think, look, that was certainly a blast from the past, and I think we've certainly learned a lot since those days, or those humble beginnings where we sort of started. But I think just to plant the seed, I think what's really important to share is that as a community, being resource rich and outcome poor. So I just want to plant that seed with everyone. So I think that's really important to, I guess, demonstrate that how things are done differently. I mean, you know, we've been screaming from the highest hilltops throughout this country for a considerable amount of time to do things and encourage, particularly government, to do things differently and find ways to for a better spend and for that spend to be more efficient, to hit the ground to benefit community firsthand, particularly with children, young people and families. That's been the key sort of mantra of our cause and our charter and our agenda. So I just want to sort of highlight that, and secondly, I just want to certainly acknowledge Ashley Wan, who's with us this evening from Justice Reinvestment New South Wales, and Jerry Collins also from Regional Department of Regional New South Wales, and of course Margot Beach, and there's so many others too, and obviously Dr. Opperman as well. Look, I think the key aspects to, and to provide some context, further context to the background and history and of, I think, data more specifically, and I think really narrowing that down to the real opportunity is to develop that step-by-step guide, you know, that operational manual. It's that roadmap, it's the blueprint that we're all sort of contributing to as a collective, I think, to strive for better outcomes and results. But along with that comes a whole range of challenges and some real difficulties as well, in terms of how do we keep community engaged, and how do we keep government enthusiastic and doing things differently as well, and finding that middle ground. And I think that's something that we've been quite fortunate to do, is to convince, particularly on one hand is community, and on the other end is government. But I think with that said, is the real rare opportunity we were given was to, and I certainly don't mean any disrespect in any shape or form towards government, but we had to, we were pretty much forced to, I guess, request that government, all tiers of government, sort of wait in the corridor until we sort of went out and developed and forged a new relationship with Corporate Australia, but also Philanthropy Australia as well. And then once we returned, we invited government back in, and at least then it was on our terms. And when I say that, I say that quite respectfully, that it was sincerely on our terms, and it remains the same, because I think if everything is, that constant theme speaking about place-based initiatives, which is really important, because as we all agree and accept that everything's place-based, but the new dimension that we've brought to this process is community-led. Now, some have really struggled with that. Some are, some are still being challenged by that. But I think we're making this sort of cut through and pioneering and paving the way and applying our interpretation to these processes and doing things differently. So, I just want to reference when I say we've been screaming from the highest hilltops. Those highest hilltops have been several scathing reports that that we've assisted and, instigated, particularly through the New South Wales Ombudsman's Office over the last 15 years, which has been quite scathing. So I think that's a bit of a marker of what needed to change, with a whole host of recommendations that are still a work in progress. So I just want to park that, and I'll just narrow that back down to, I think, data. Specifically to when we started the journey of requesting data, one thing I will admit, I end up with writer's cramp. During that time, it was back during 2013-2014 period, when we were writing off to the Commonwealth and state government and everyone in between. And but what was quite, I guess, frustrating was, but on the other hand too, it was no sort of surprise, again, coming up against that sort of gatekeeper mentality, and really that gatekeeper mentality was dictating the terms how we were to utilise data. So it came with a whole host of guidelines, caveats, etc. So I just want to also just point that out. But I think over time is that whole sort of experience was that once the gatekeeper mentality, that softened over time. And I think that was as a result of when we had launched our first data document back in September 2015, how we illustrated how we were utilising data and telling the story. And I often refer to the particular document itself. We were quite fortunate to develop two versions, and it was based on a life course. Doug, could you just open that out, please, Christy? Which is really important because now that's double-sided. That's the comprehensive version. We've got a reduced version as well. But I often refer to the back page, and particularly where when offences were occurring during 2013-2014 period, where offences were occurring between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. 30%, and there was 48% offences were predominantly happening over the weekend period. So again, we've illustrated that in such a way that you don't have to be a rocket scientist, or in this case a chief data scientist, no disrespect to Dr. Opperman, of course. But what's really important is that we clearly demonstrated how to, I guess, shift those resources. I mean, in reality was that we changed that 9 to 5 mentality in the service sector as well. So what we have now, just by illustrating that diagram, was that now we're the closing hours of youth services are much later. So there, and with extra resources and support, etc. So that's another way of telling the story on which is quite practical. So we've simplified that and narrowed that down to simplify how we tell the story. But with that said, is that we're also capturing those outcomes. And I'll just back it up a moment too. I think what's really important, what we've brought to this process, has been the opportunity to really shift the service sector from being reactive, becoming now more responsive. And my point around that is that we've implemented the Marinuka daily check-in process. Now, what that means is that we bring together the service sector to discuss what's occurred in the last 24 hours, as opposed to traditionally we'd be waiting for next fortnight, next month, next quarter to be discussing a whole host of backlog of issues. So my point around shifting the service sector from being reactive now becoming responsive, there it is. But what's really important here too is what we've applied to this is the integrated, coordinated case support model. That's really important too, because it is integrated, it is coordinated more effectively, as opposed to having several key services, whether it be government and a combination of NGOs, etc., standing in Indian file waiting to speak to the one client or one family. So we've really minimised and reduced that as well. And so these are sort of things that we've managed to sort of break through. But and I mean, at the core of that has been the data and how we've accessed and utilised that data. And the other point I just want to make too is that it's great to feel not alone in this journey. So I think with, particularly with SEER and certainly our critical friends such as Justice Reinvestment New South Wales and Collaboration for Impact and all tiers of government, it is this sort of shared outcome and indicator sort of response that also includes a whole range of circuit breakers that we're still a work in progress as well as they unfold. But I think my earlier point around it, at least I think we're really on track to develop that blueprint because we're at that varying levels in the readiness and preparation, not only community but also with government. One of those examples is that I'm also part of the Commonwealth in conjunction with, in partnership I should say, with state government and territory governments through the Deputy Secretary's data subgroup. Now that is focused specifically on, I guess, re-educating, realigning, resetting the relationship with the APS or the Australian Public Service, which is really important because I think it's that readiness and preparation that we are preparing people to do things quite differently, and that's going to be quite important as we're moving forward, as we're sort of cutting through. So I might, I tend to ramble on a bit, so I might hand over.
Would you like me? No, Alistair, this is an amazing foundational document. You said 2013, which really set the future for what data would be required, and now fast forward 10 years and it's been quite a journey, as you said. The Palomar data platform, powered by SEER, includes more than 10 years of data. In fact, it's a very rich data asset. 15 different contributors, restricted data from government agencies and service providers coming into the Palomar platform for use by Marinuka and governed by the Burke Tribal Council. And that's growing all the time, including, you know, Commonwealth data, investment data, standardised investment data from New South Wales government, and in an automated way now. No more writer's crap, I hope. Can you tell me, Palomar, how is data and how is the Palomar data platform helping shift the power to community-led decision-making for Burke? How, the tangibility of it, what does it really mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at the heart and at the core of that is the earlier point Amity had made in the introduction, was that data and how we're accessing and utilising data is certainly at the core of making improved decision making, but it's also that empowerment because essentially as part of the core is that it's now bringing that informed decision making through cultural authority. So that's been key to the ownership and custodianship as well, in terms of we're just not a client or a customer. We're a valued stakeholder, shareholder at the table. So I think it's how we've taken that place over time. But I think, sort of going back to the heart of your question, is that it's how we're. It's still a work in progress, I think, on two fronts. One is that operationalising self-determination. This is our interpretation of that, not someone else sitting in, whether it be Canberra or Macquarie Street in our case, and how we're applying that cultural authority and giving that real kudos, I think, to community as we're striving to, and again, just re-emphasising striving for those better outcomes and results for children, young people and families. But I think what's really important here is that it's the sustainability, having, which is still a work in progress, is that authorising environment. But I think over the near future, I think I'm confident we're going to be able to, I think, establish that. But I think it comes back to John's point around earlier point of building that trust, but also that trust and confidence, and that takes a lot of hard work. I think for something that's so complex and sophisticated, how we've really, taken with the support of SEER and all our critical friends to simplify that as much as possible.
Just wanted to ask you a question before I invite Margot and Ian to join us. We are soon going to go to the referendum on the Voice, and I'm curious about how Palomar and data gives Maranoka and the Burke Tribal Council in Burke a voice in self-determination, and how do you see, the referendum's results impacting potentially your work?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things worthy of highlighting as well. I think on one hand is me personally, I'm quite confident that the yes vote will just get over, and fingers crossed. But on the other end is that we also have a contingency plan that in the case of a no vote as well. And I often sort of refer to our principles as a great example of how we intend to continue doing business, whether we have a voice or we don't. So, and I'm referring to our principles that 12 principles that we've developed over quite some time in partnership and collaboration with all our critical friends and government, of course. And point 6, of course, is data specifically and access and data sharing, etc. So that's our backup plan and contingency plan. That'll be business as usual, whether it's for or against, I think. But I think it is a prime example of decision making and that authorising environment that we've managed to forge over, particularly over the last decade. And at least, and I'll give an example, is that during the 2016-2017 period, or the financial period, was we engaged KPMG that done some economic modelling that provided the economic analysis of coming from another sort of way of doing things differently, because initially we were asking government, what was the global investment into such a small community such as Burke, for something that appeared to be or viewed or perceived as being so practical and simple became so complex and sophisticated. So we thought, well, for whatever reason, there was pushback and reluctance and etc. So we came the other way from a savings perspective. So, and again, just emphasising the key aspects to a range of flexible funding and support and various services doing their part within their remit. we managed to save government $3.1 million just during that financial period, with a future projection of in excess of several $1 million over the next 5 years. So with that said, and then obviously then along came COVID, but let's park that for a moment, that's another conversation. But I think what's really important here is that I think this is where we've captured now the imagination and I think the appetite. We've really dampened the appetite of doing things differently because we've clearly demonstrated that savings aspect. And but along with that is that how we've told the story through, and also truth-telling, being candid, being upfront, and about what's working well. And I think what's quite unique with our situation as well is that now we get to sort of pull up and smell the roses and celebrate what's working well as a collective, as a community. It's just not all doom and gloom on the challenges, and which then I'll just come back quickly to the shared outcomes and indicators. It is that shared outcomes, and the indicators are our priorities, and but I think it's how we manage expectations to those indicators is that it is the short-term, intermediate, medium, long-term aspects to that. So that's how we manage it.
Thank you, Alistair. So I'd love to welcome Margot Beach and Dr. Ian Opperman to join us. Please take a seat. Margot Beach is the... Excuse me. Everyone, Margot Beach is the General Manager of Dusseldorp Forum and has worked in the philanthropic sector for nearly 10 years. Prior to this sector, she's worked in the community services sector for the past 30 years and is committed to engage with compassion, mindfulness and respect in all of the work that you do. So very keen to hear from you. And of course, many of you will know Dr. Ian Opperman. Dr. Ian Opperman is the Chief Data Scientist of New South Wales and on the board, standards lead for international standards work and many, many other things. And as I often say, the Bono of data science. we all know that he is the data science rock star. So, Margot, thank you so much for joining us as well. You've been involved with Maranoka since the very beginning, and you have so much insight into what's going on. What do you think needs to happen at a policy level, and what is your ask of philanthropy?
Great questions. Thanks very much for the invitation. I guess first I'd like to just set the scene and say, you know, it's been such a privilege for us as a philanthropic family foundation working alongside Alistair and the team and community in Bourke. We were invited in, and you know, as so often in our work, you never quite know where the relationship, the investment, the time will go. But we saw this as an opportunity to really better understand what the community was wanting to work towards, and to be able to see that they really needed the support in order to be able to build, if you like, the container in which they needed to be able to start to build and lean in towards different ways of working and testing solutions and looking at the data first and foremost, so that was their roadmap to better understanding and prioritising what the work would be into those very early days. So for us, I guess, you know, we also wanted to be able to stand alongside and showcase that to have a dedicated team, call it whatever, but you know, the phrase backbone has become the norm, to really support the collective work that's required in community across the service system, which is about the coordinating, facilitating, is a real requirement, and government wasn't funding that at the time. So we really came around and supported that initial 5-year funding so that that was able to give Marinuka those early starts and to be able to build the strength of that, that team to drive the work. I think for the philanthropic sector, it's certainly been a really incredible journey to watch how place-based work has matured and grown. And I think with, you know, the example of Marinuka and the community of Burke and what Alistair has spoken to us about is it's very pioneering what occurred in those early days, particularly around the data. You know, we all know that data can be quite challenging to be made available to community. There's often, you know, some suspicion around why are you requesting data, what's it going to be utilised for, how will it be interpreted. But what in fact we observed, and certainly what I've spent a lot of time over the 10 years experiencing, is the real richness and the way in which data has been the informant for community to have richer and deeper conversations around what are the priorities and how do we actually want to invest resourcing into building solutions, implementing and testing. So data's absolutely critical, and it has been, and it's just, you know, for me, I would like to see the amount of data that's available and the way in which this community has interpreted and utilised the data rolled out across many other communities. I think for the philanthropic sector, that's been a real aha moment, you know. And I think that what the data has done is that it's been able to tell a much richer story, particularly around the contextualising, and then of course the story of impact. So we, I guess, you know, as a small family foundation, we don't have a, you know, we don't have the resources that perhaps other foundations do. We operate in a way that's fairly agile, I would say, Alistair. We spend time in community and we try and work with the partnership to draw on our own internal expertise, because that may not be something that the partnership has access to and requires, but also we draw from our network and our colleagues either across the corporate or business or other foundations to really strengthen the work in community and to be able to build the capability of staff within the community to continue doing the work and to build on the work. I'd really like to see, I guess, more of a collective approach in the philanthropic sector around place-based work, and we have tried and tested that, and that works really well. And why I'm so, I guess, keen for that to grow is that every philanthropic organisation has something different to contribute, and I think that only but benefits place, you know. I think the other thing that I would really, you know, I guess just underline is the value add of untied funds. And for some, that's a really unusual concept. But once again, something that John talked about, it's building on trust, and it's also about providing flexibility and being able to, I guess, you know, have the conversations around what are the priorities, what are the requirements, but not actually, you know, taking that leadership around making those fundings attached to a particular priority and knowing that community and priorities change. Yeah.
Letting community take the lead.
Letting community take the lead, that's right.
And before I go to Ian, we were talking earlier about what you think needs to happen with policy, at a policy level.
Yeah.
Could you share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think, you know, once again, the community of Burke has really shown me this, is that in government we have, I guess, an opportunity now to really try and look at current policies and how they are impacting or affecting the work that's happening organically but sophistically in community to address issues that arise. And I think sometimes the policies into practice are not reflective of what's happening in community. And perhaps the next iteration of this work, as it matures, is about getting closer to understanding, are these policies of value, and are they, you know, are they inhibiting the work that's happening across communities, or are they actually there to support the work? And I would suggest that, you know, there's an opportunity now to really start doing that analysis work and to really understand where the gaps are, and to be brave enough to work in a collaborative, I guess, disciplinary way to really get some, you know, understanding of what's not working and how a policy is actually blocking that progress. So for me, I guess that's the step for me on the road to sustainability around this way of working, because, you know, there's been many years where philanthropic have funded this. Government has now stepped in, both state and federal, but I'm not seeing that as the, you know, as the, I guess, way of funding into the future without, you know, the continual kind of cycles of the budget bids. So I think sustainability is required, and I think data and the analysis and contextualising of the data onto impact is all part of telling the story around building towards sustainability of this way of working.
So it sounds like we're just at the beginning almost.
Well, it's exciting.
It is
it's very exciting.
So we agree with you about the importance of scaling and making data available to communities around Australia for data-informed decision-making to drive to the kinds of results and outcomes you're talking about, Alistair, not only the savings, but also the creating a safe, smart, strong community. Ian, question for you. How do we scale this? How do we scale what Palomar and Marinuka has illustrated is possible? Because the Burke has the source of truth on what's actually happening in Burke across multiple different agencies, federal, state jurisdictions and service providers. How do we scale that in an efficient manner across Australia?
Thank you, that's a great question. I'm going to actually start response by just reflecting on something John said. He joined data slowly and then very quickly. My data journey literally started at the speed of light, working in the radio communications networks where data is the product. Everything about the network is data, and it's literally travelling at the speed of light. What I've learned over time is to slow down a little bit and try to understand in context of human sharing of data about people and the humanness of the willingness to accept and understand and listen to what the data is saying. That takes quite a lot of time to build up the trust and to build up the environment where people are really willing to listen or really willing to pay attention to the insights that are generated. I had the opportunity to actually go out to Burke. It was the end of 2019, last couple of working days before the end of the year, and it was very hot. And I joined one of these data conversations and sat and listened to people talking about data and talking about individuals and talking about that joined up connected care, the joined up wraparound services, and really started to understand that there was something very special about Marinuka and something very special about this community. And it wasn't sharing data in the form that I was used to, sharing large files. It was sharing information about people in a sensitive way for the goal of improving the life outcomes of individuals. And it was a really powerful experience. It was very hot. And so I came away from that thinking differently about data and thinking differently about trust. We'd also been given a project to look at when I was running the Data Analytics Centre, to look at the success factors of Burke and what was replicable to other communities. And the thing that really makes it work is trust. And trust is a tricky thing to scale. Now, standards were mentioned earlier. I'm a huge fan of standards. Standards help with the frameworks. And out of all of the issues, the reasons people don't want to share data, it's unwilling, unable, not allowed. And the unable part really is about data sharing frameworks. And I've dedicated a big chunk of my life for the last 7 or 8 years trying to develop practical data sharing frameworks and literally leading development of international standards on data sharing. But the unwilling and the not allowed are the two really tricky ones. Not allowed is, can I share this data? Which side of the line around the authorizing framework will I land on about allowed to or not? And very often people fall on the not allowed. It's just an easier way of actually addressing the bigger issue is the unwilling. And the unwilling really is cultural. The unwilling really speaks to all those elements of the concerns about unintended consequences, the concerns about revealing information, sensitive information, the concerns about other people really needing to understand the context of this data in order to appropriately use it and to use things that you create from it, whether they're insights or whether they're analytics or dashboards, whatever the case may be. All of those things ultimately come down to trust, and scaling trust has those elements of, can I find a framework so that, with the equivalent of data analogy, a bit like electricity, can I safely bring my data to the right voltage and use it in a safe way that I won't electrocute myself? But then, can I do that in a way where I trust that the use of the data and the data products will be done appropriately, and they will be done in a way which is beneficial for the community and beneficial for me? So partly it's the tools, partly it's acknowledging that we can really now pick up tools, pick up standards, pick up platforms and scale. Partly it's some of those elements that exist of community helping themselves. Partly it's also community seeing themselves in the data and appropriately being shared back. So there's really a lot to this issue of scaling, but some of it is the tools, some of it is the frameworks, but it's actually all about trust.
Thanks, Ian. So I'd love to invite questions from the audience. Does anyone have a burning question? Max, please.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this together, Christy. Thank you, everybody. I'm really interested in that idea of architecting trust. I'd love to know more about that. But my question is really around this idea of operationalizing self-empowerment and letting community lead with data. I'm reminded of the analogy around teaching a person to fish. You know, like give them a fish, they eat for a day. Teach them a fish, they eat for their lifetime. And I'm wondering whether and how you all are thinking about teaching these skills. You know, to architect, to engineer, and to analyze data to folks in the community. Thanks.
How do we build capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, coming back to, I don't think it's overly ambitious. It's I think a burning conversation that we'll be reaching out to, particularly to, I guess, the Minister for Education to look at, or perhaps consider, a proof of concept around looking at implementing, I guess, data more broadly to the high school curriculum, so we can start sort of that early development and start preparing young people to perhaps take up a career, developing those pathways to data. And so I think that's achievable. But I think, and furthermore, I think it's an opportunity to build the workforce as well around data. So I think over the next 10 years, I'm certainly confident that data will be certainly at the core of everything we do. So I think this is an essential part. Back to your question, I think essential part of the successional plan. That the key role that young people have in this process, and I think talking about jobs that haven't even been created yet in this front. So
that's right, and new community data analyst roles that are being funded by philanthropy all over Australia, and capacity building and micro-credentials popping up everywhere, and so much happening in this space, incredibly exciting. Thank you for the question. Another question, hello. Maddie, hi Maddie.
Thank you very much. Maddie from Huber Social. This has been a really wonderful event to see some of the work that's been happening in Burke and to see the that power of data as a first-hand experience there. And I guess my question comes around, it's enough to have data, but how do we know that we're collecting the right data and that we're asking the right questions from that data? The government has just recently delivered their Measuring What Matters framework, which is really quite wonderful because for the first time it's kind of taking the focus away from return on investment and finances as the pinnacle of what we should be measuring and putting it more into well-being and subjective well-being, to hear from people themselves rather than, I guess, putting onto people what we believe that their well-being should be or how they should achieve that. So my question is around in Burke as the example, how did you know that you were asking the right questions in general to have this data? What did that data look like, and that you're right, like asking the right questions then of that data?
Another great question, and I think to narrow down on that is that what's really important here too is that as part of our theory of change is that it's how we capture test cases, case studies and testimonials. What the testimonials and the case studies in particular, and I often refer to the test cases as the challenges. It's those systemic barriers, but moving more towards the, I think the testimonials and case studies is that it's how we test the accuracy of that, because it really relies on the honesty of that individual, that family, to tell their story, and obviously that needs to be consensual and etc. But so that's really key. That and that's another part of the empowerment piece. People are given the opportunity to tell their story. But one thing I often sort of refer to is the early times I mentioned earlier in terms of the because it provides a customer service experience as well. But I just want to sort of bring it back to the Maranoka Daily check-in process, because I want monitoring and in terms of where people are ending up, and from those early days, they'd be referred to a particular NGO, to a service. Then all of a sudden, what pops up at the end of the week is that there's a green space in the last column says completed. Well, completed what? There's the whole story missing, and I think that comes back to the heart of, you know, what we're trying to achieve but improve. But again, encouraging people to give that real customer service experience.
And thanks for the question on measuring what matters, and indicator frameworks in general that are focused on well-being. You know, we advocate for that data to be available at a local level, and as you would see in measuring what matters, much of it is survey data and is not available locally, or some of it's ABS. So our work in conversation with Treasury is, and how do you make that data available at a local level to align to those indicators, and how do you let communities pick and choose what indicators are important to them? Because we have so many frameworks, Safe, Smart, Strong being the wonderful framework that was developed more recently in Burke, and the indicators across the data set that Burke has, there are something like 160 indicators or more across that are able to be measured using the data asset. So I think what's really exciting is really understanding what communities' questions are, how to map that to the data, making sure it's available locally, and giving communities adaptability and flexibility to align not only with national frameworks, state, and then create their own. And I think that's where we see the flowers blooming.
And if I can just jump in and say, on a practical level, Maranoka has a strategic plan, and all of those 3 areas of priority have a process, a local governance process called working groups, that happen throughout the year where the service system and others gather, where data is shared, and there's an analysis of that data with a lived experience, not only from the service system but from community. So that's another touch point that has the opportunity to look at what the data is telling us, and is this the right data that we're collecting for this particular area of issue.
I think I have time maybe for one more question, Amity, and then we're going to break. And then have a drink and something to eat. Did you have a question?
Hi, my name is Talia. I am from Just Reinvest New South Wales, and I'm new to the new role of Data and Research Manager. So my question is for you, Alistair. What would you say have been the most valuable data tools that you've used over the last decade? So you mentioned this pamphlet that had, a simple infographic and a more detailed version. The example of the statistic that you gave, very simple, straightforward, and impactful for you. What other tangible tools have you found really valuable and impactful, and what are some of the outcomes you've been able to achieve with them?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a great question, I think. And again, I think to bring that back to, I guess, the conversations, the community conversations we've had, particularly with young people. And it's probably as the opportunity to certainly acknowledge the former Minister for Aboriginal Affairs is really where which was Victor Dominello. We had a theory of change that we developed, that we made an approach, and we convinced the Minister at the time to make a worthy investment, which was a modest $30,000 investment into allowing us to engage a consultant to capture the voices of young people through that process. Was that it was that real sort of and the richness of the response from young people that was quite intriguing, but so it was from that we started developing a specific sort of charter or agenda on young people. So that was the real starting point. But with that said, was that then we sort of that carried over to our early efforts in terms of evaluation, and what we found as a result to the lack of that expertise and skill set at the time was. What we found was two things. People, particularly women, were telling us that they were feeling safer, and secondly, they were, and men, of course, and young people were feeling much better about themselves. So they were the early sort of indicators, and that came as a result to sort of my earlier point around those circuit breakers. Now, those circuit breakers and those indicators and priority areas, I didn't sit in a dark room and develop that. Community did. So it was sitting at the kitchen table, it was sitting on the riverbank, it was sitting at the park, it was sitting wherever people were feeling comfortable. But they were the real early signs of that breakthrough, and I think it, again, it's coming back to John's earlier point around that trust. And but with that trust, there was certainly a lot of distrust too that was sort of built over time. So that was, that was I think a real telling sort of experience of how people really interpret their own experiences. Because at one stage when we started talking about data, and particularly young people were saying, well, do we get a $50 recharge on our mobiles? They were talking about data until we sort of narrowed that down. But and that's probably an example. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. It just shows how far we've come. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Margot. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to hand back to Amity in a moment. Just quickly to summarise a broad, rich conversation. I think we've heard, and Alistair, we joke about this, but we've heard about all of your work mustering the kangaroos over many, many years to get to this point. Fantastic, congratulations, and really excited for the future. It's a very exciting moment. Data really is seen at the federal and state levels as an important resource for public benefit, and we are scaling this into many communities. John mentioned before, 50 communities around Australia, and we've got a plan for scaling out sharing of restricted data assets, open data, community data that's held and owned by community in many places. So with trust at the centre, and we hope that you will join us on this journey. Thank you.
Can I interrupt a little bit for the VIP, because we have one very interesting question from online audience. Can we ask that question? Yes. I think there are 40-some people online watching throughout the whole event. I'm sure they want to have that question addressed as well. I think it might be for Ian as well. You mentioned earlier security, integrity, and provenance are vital for the trust. Mitigate the risk of mistakes at best, or maybe malicious intent. So when you share the data out there, what are the practical approach we could mitigate those risks of misusing the data?
How much time do we have? So, I'm kidding. This won't take more than 45 minutes. So, we need to think about data from its life cycle, from where it was created, how it was transmitted, how it's stored, and then we need to think about all the things that we can know about that data on its life cycle before we use it. And largely that's metadata. And metadata, of course, is the data about the data. Think about a Coke bottle and all the information about the Coke bottle, the shape of the bottle, the branding on it, the use by date, the manufacture date, the barcode. We need that metadata to appropriately understand whether or not we can use that data. Secondly, we need to test the data against the use case we have in mind to see whether it's fit for purpose. That really takes some judgment. And then when we create a data product, whether it's a report or an insight or an alert or an alarm, a decision or an action, we need to put in place restrictions, guidance, prohibitions in some cases, or recommendations about what to do with that data product. So if we are good people trying to do good things with data and data products, then we can use and develop frameworks which are systematic, repeatable, and hopefully very soon standardized. If we're bad people wanting to do bad things, throw that out the window. It's a different kettle of fish. But a lot of it has to do with repeatable patterns of use, repeatable patterns of data sharing, and a lot of it has to do with metadata, and then at the data product, guidance, restrictions, or prohibitions about how we use that.
Thank you. So I just have the role of winding up, but I'd like to conclude with thanking our speakers, so John, Christy, Alistair, Margot and Ian. And also thanks to everybody who's in the room today, and for all of those on the live stream as well. I hope today's discussion, you found it valuable, and that each and every one of you are inspired about what's possible with data sharing, and some ideas about how you in your own roles, in your own work and your own lives can help enable this movement and the sharing of data and the enabling of community-led and shared decision-making, which really is achieving great outcomes and has the potential to do so much more. So for those who are here this evening, please stay on. We have refreshments and drinks. And for those on the live stream, goodbye and thank you, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you very much.